The order was already moving before anyone noticed it had arrived. It existed first as alignment. Identical pages stacked, stamped, numbered, and copied. Language repeated without variation. Words arranged to remove interpretation. Sentences written to survive distance, delay, and human presence. It moved through channels designed to prevent friction, each transfer confirmed by signature, each signature placed where it had been placed thousands of times before. No voice carried it. No face accompanied it. It traveled without urgency because urgency was unnecessary. The system it entered was built to receive it. The pathways were prepared long before the ink dried. Every junction recognized the format. Every desk recognized the spacing. There was nothing irregular to slow it. It passed through hands trained not to pause, hands trained to check, to verify, to forward. The process did not require belief, only recognition. The order did not persuade, it instructed. Its authority was embedded in its structure, not in its content. It did not explain itself. It did not invite confirmation. It simply aligned with procedure and moved on. Each time it was received, it became smaller, reduced to a task, reduced to a line item, reduced to a scheduled action. The language that had once been whole was broken into components and distributed. No single recipient held the entirety. No single recipient needed to. The system ensured coherence without comprehension. Timing was specified. Sequence was specified. Contingency was absent. The order did not ask whether conditions matched its assumptions. It assumed they would. It was written with the confidence that conditions always did. It relied on calendars, not terrain, on synchronization, not observation. It treated uncertainty as an administrative problem already solved. There was no moment where it could be challenged, because no moment presented itself as exceptional. The order resembled every other order that had preceded it. The phrasing followed precedent. The margins followed regulation. Even its urgency was regulated, expressed in standardized terms that carried no emotion. It moved downward through levels designed to translate intention into motion. At each level, it lost abstraction and gained specificity. Tasks were extracted and reassigned. Responsibilities were narrowed. The space for judgment was compressed until it disappeared entirely. Those who received it understood their role immediately, not because they understood the outcome, but because they understood the mechanism. This was not a request for interpretation. It was a confirmation of position within a sequence. To hesitate would have been a deviation. To question would have required justification. No justification had been requested. The system rewarded continuity. The order provided it. Once issued, it could not be recalled without creating disruption. Disruption required explanation. Explanation required authority. Authority, in this case, had already spoken. The document bore the markings that ended discussion before it began. By the time the final copy was acknowledged, the order no longer existed as an idea. It existed as momentum. It did not matter who had written it. It did not matter why. What mattered was that it had entered a structure designed to convert certainty into action without reflection. From that moment forward, nothing else was required. The outcome was already sealed. The structure that received the order had been built to eliminate pause. It was layered, not to distribute power, but to distribute certainty. Each level existed to narrow scope and accelerate execution. Authority was not concentrated at the top. It was diffused downward, fragmented into responsibilities that could not see beyond their assigned boundaries. No single position was designed to evaluate the whole. Evaluation had been replaced by transmission. The order moved through this structure along predetermined paths. Each level interpreted the same instruction in a different operational language, but the meaning never changed. It did not evolve. It did not adapt. It was reduced. At the highest level where it was first received, the order was complete, dense, abstract, written to encompass an entire operation without touching its edges. It assumed alignment across units that had never met. It assumed timing across distances that could not be observed simultaneously. These assumptions were not reckless. They were institutional. They had been used before. They had been validated by prior success. That validation had been absorbed into doctrine. As the order descended, it was broken apart. One section became a schedule, another became a movement directive, another became a coordination requirement between elements that shared no direct communication. Each fragment was clean, unambiguous, and stripped of context. Context was unnecessary. Context introduced variability. Those responsible for receiving and forwarding the order were not chosen for creativity. They were chosen for reliability. Training emphasized consistency over insight, precision over adaptability. The system had been refined through repetition, not reflection. Every recipient understood the consequences of deviation, not punishment in the dramatic sense, but disruption, delays, reports, explanations. The burden of standing out in a structure that prized invisibility. Compliance was not enforced through fear, it was enforced through normalization. The order passed through rooms that looked identical to one another, desks arranged at the same angles, documents placed in the same orientation, language spoken in the same controlled cadence. The environment itself reinforced predictability. There was no space for improvisation because improvisation had no designated place. At each level, acknowledgement was required. Not agreement, not understanding, only confirmation of receipt. Each acknowledgement fed back upward, creating the appearance of control. The system monitored itself constantly, not for accuracy, but for continuity. No one asked whether the assumptions embedded in the order remained valid. That question did not belong to any position in the chain. The authority to question had been abstracted away at the moment the order was formalized. Once written, it became resistant to reality. Those closest to execution were the least empowered to alter it. They received instructions already translated into exact movements, exact timings, exact alignments. Their role was not to think, it was to synchronize. Their effectiveness was measured by how closely their actions matched the plan. Those further removed from execution retained the language of strategy, but not the ability to observe conditions directly. Distance was interpreted as objectivity. Reports moved upward, stripped of ambiguity, condensed into standardized formats that preserved clarity by removing nuance. The chain of command functioned as intended. Information flowed upward. Orders flowed downward. At no point did they intersect. Each level trusted the one above it to have considered what it could not see. Each level trusted the one below it to execute without deviation. Trust replaced verification. Verification was inefficient. The system had been designed for scale. Scale required simplification. Simplification required assumptions. Assumptions, once embedded, became invisible. There were moments where friction could have occurred. Minor discrepancies, timing adjustments, environmental variables that did not match the schedule precisely. These were absorbed without escalation. The structure treated them as noise. Noise was filtered out to preserve signal. No alarms were triggered. No thresholds were crossed. Nothing violated protocol strongly enough to justify intervention. The order remained valid because the system defined validity procedurally, not situationally. As the final directives were issued at the lowest level, the language had become purely functional. Move here. Begin then. Maintain formation. Hold until further instruction. There was no space left for interpretation, because interpretation had been resolved upstream. The chain of command had done its work. The order was no longer a document. It was a configuration of people, resources, and timing locked into alignment. Once alignment was achieved, deviation became impossible without collapse, and collapse was not authorized. Execution began without announcement. There was no signal marking the transition from preparation to action. The order did not arrive again. It simply continued. Tasks that had been scheduled were now due. Movements that had been planned were now initiated. The distinction between instruction and reality dissolved quietly, without ceremony. Each component acted when its designated time arrived. Not earlier, not later. Synchronization replaced awareness. The system did not rely on observation to confirm readiness. It relied on clocks. When the prescribed minute passed, action followed automatically. The order had converted time into authority. Coordination occurred without communication. Each element moved according to its assigned segment, trusting that all others would do the same. The design assumed simultaneity. It assumed compliance across distances that could not be measured in real time. This assumption was not debated. It had been validated by rehearsal, by paperwork, by prior success in controlled conditions. There were no questions, because there was nothing to ask. The instructions were complete. Each action had been reduced to a procedure, each procedure to a checklist. Checklists were followed. Deviations were not anticipated, because anticipation required acknowledgement of uncertainty. Uncertainty had no place in the order. The system favored clarity over perception. Those executing the order did not need to see beyond their immediate task. Seeing more would have been irrelevant. Their responsibility ended at completion, not at consequence. Completion was defined narrowly and measured precisely. Movements unfolded with mechanical accuracy. Units shifted according to prearranged patterns. Timelines overlapped as designed. The absence of improvisation created the impression of control. The system appeared efficient because nothing resisted it. Reports were generated as required. Each report confirmed progress, not conditions. Language remained standardized. Status was described using approved terms that conveyed compliance, not complexity. Information that could not be categorized was omitted by default. There were moments where reality diverged slightly from expectation. Distances felt longer. Alignments were imperfect. Timing did not compress space as effectively as planned. These discrepancies were not interpreted as warnings. They were interpreted as variations within acceptable limits. The order did not include provisions for adjustment. Adjustment implied discretion. Discretion implied authority. Authority had already been exercised. The absence of flexibility was not an oversight. It was a feature. Flexibility introduced unpredictability, and unpredictability undermined synchronization. Those closest to the unfolding situation did not possess the language required to interrupt it. Their vocabulary had been shaped by procedure. To describe deviation required terms that did not exist in their reporting framework. Without language, recognition remained internal and unexpressed. Silence persisted, not because nothing was wrong, but because nothing was formally wrong yet. The order continued to move through the system as confirmations accumulated. Each completed task reinforced the assumption that the plan was functioning. Each acknowledgement fed back into the structure, strengthening confidence at levels removed from execution. No individual step appeared dangerous in isolation. Risk existed only in aggregation. Aggregation was invisible to those assigned to fragments. The system had divided responsibility so thoroughly that no single position could perceive the emerging pattern. Momentum increased as more components locked into place. The cost of interruption rose with each completed phase. To halt execution now would have required justification stronger than procedure. Procedure was all that existed. The order did not respond to environment. The environment was expected to conform. Where it did not, the discrepancy was absorbed locally and unreported. Local adaptation occurred only to preserve timing, not to alter intent. Execution advanced according to plan, according to schedule, according to authority. By the time the first irreversible actions were completed, the order had already passed beyond the reach of those carrying it out. It existed above them, embedded in coordination they could not see and could not alter. What remained was motion, and motion, once initiated, required no further permission. The failure did not announce itself. It emerged as misalignment, subtle enough to be dismissed at first. A delay that did not register as a delay because it remained within the margins allowed by planning. A position reached on time, but not in the configuration assumed by the order. A sequence completed precisely, yet disconnected from the sequence it was meant to support. The system registered none of this as error. Reports continued to arrive, formatted correctly, stamped correctly, transmitted through approved channels. Progress was logged. Milestones were marked as achieved. The structure interpreted compliance as success. The order did not account for divergence. It had been written to function under the assumption that every element would encounter the same conditions it had been designed for. When that assumption failed, the failure did not propagate upward as alarm. It diffused laterally as confusion. contained within compartments that could not communicate meaningfully with one another. Those closest to the discrepancy recognized it only as inconvenience. Something was not where it was expected to be. Something else had arrived earlier than planned. These observations did not align with any reportable category. They were not violations. They were irregularities without authority. The order remained unchanged. Timelines continued to advance. Tasks scheduled later assumed the successful completion of tasks scheduled earlier. The system did not verify outcomes. It verified sequence. If Step 1 had been reported as complete, Step 2 proceeded. Verification ended where acknowledgement began. As more components executed their instructions, the space for correction narrowed. Dependencies became active. Actions taken could no longer be reversed without disrupting those already underway. The system interpreted this interdependence as robustness. In reality, it was fragility distributed across distance. Attempts to reconcile discrepancies occurred quietly and locally. Minor adjustments were made to preserve alignment with the order, rather than with reality. The goal was not correction, it was conformity. Conformity maintained the appearance of control. Communication intensified but remained constrained. Messages increased in frequency without increasing in substance. Language remained procedural, stripped of urgency by design. The vocabulary available could describe delay, but not danger. It could describe deviation, but not consequence. At higher levels, the picture appeared stable. Reports confirmed execution. No thresholds had been crossed that required intervention. The absence of explicit failure was interpreted as success in progress. The order's authority grew stronger with each passing confirmation. The system's rigidity became visible only in hindsight, but at the time it felt like discipline. The refusal to adapt was not perceived as refusal. It was perceived as consistency. The structure rewarded those who maintained alignment with the plan, even as conditions shifted beneath it. As the order continued to assert itself, warning signs multiplied without coalescing. No single signal was sufficient to justify stopping. The system required clarity to act, and clarity could not emerge from fragments. The first significant consequences appeared not as catastrophe, but as absence. Support that did not arrive. Coordination that did not materialize. Expected outcomes that failed to manifest without explanation. These absences were noted, but not escalated. Absence was ambiguous. Ambiguity was filtered out. The order did not fail in a single moment. It failed incrementally through accumulation. Each compliant action added weight to a structure already misaligned. Each step taken as instructed increased the distance between intent and reality. Those who began to sense the magnitude of the problem lacked the authority to redefine it. Those with authority lacked the visibility to perceive it. The system had separated perception from power with precision. The order remained valid on paper. The machinery continued to move forward, converting procedure into consequence. By the time the failure could no longer be interpreted as variation, the system had already committed itself fully. The order was no longer a directive, it was inertia, and inertia does not respond to warning. Collapse did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded as convergence. Separate failures, each previously contained, began to intersect. Dependencies that had been abstract on paper became physical. Timelines that had been assumed independent collided. The structure that had maintained order through separation now transmitted failure through connection. The system attempted to compensate automatically. Procedures designed for minor disruption were activated in sequence. Redundancies engaged, not to correct the underlying flaw, but to preserve motion. Each corrective measure assumed the validity of the order itself. None addressed the premise. Reports changed in tone without changing in content. Language became tighter. Updates arrived more frequently. Status indicators shifted categories, but remained within acceptable ranges. The machinery of communication worked harder, producing more confirmation, more evidence of compliance. What failed first was coordination. Elements that had been aligned by schedule discovered they were no longer aligned by reality. Support arrived where it was no longer relevant. Movements occurred precisely where conditions no longer permitted them. The order continued to demand simultaneity long after simultaneity had become impossible. There was no command to stop. Stopping required authority equal to issuing. Issuing had already occurred. The system did not contain a mechanism for negation, only for continuation. Every action taken reinforced the next. Momentum replaced discretion. As consequences accumulated, they did not trigger reversal. They triggered acceleration. The structure interpreted resistance as delay, delay as inefficiency, inefficiency as something to be overcome through increased adherence. Discipline intensified precisely where flexibility was required. Loss appeared as absence before it appeared as scale. Communications went unanswered, not because channels were broken, but because the recipients were no longer positioned to respond. Movements completed without effect. Resources arrived without recipients. These were logged as anomalies, not as warnings. The order did not acknowledge depletion. It did not account for exhaustion. It assumed availability where availability no longer existed. The system continued to request confirmation from components that could no longer provide it. Silence expanded unevenly. At lower levels, activity became fragmented. Actions continued without coordination, driven by the last instruction received. Without updated directives, units adhered to the final authorized version of the plan. Authority persisted, even after relevance ended. At higher levels, the picture fractured. Data no longer aligned cleanly. Reports contradicted one another without violating format. The system responded by delaying interpretation, not by intervening. Interpretation required certainty. Certainty was no longer achievable. The collapse was not marked by a single event. It was marked by saturation. The accumulation of consequences reached a point where procedure could no longer mask outcome. What had been absorbed as variation exceeded the capacity of the structure to contain it. When recognition finally occurred, it did not produce change. It produced paralysis. No instruction existed for this condition. No doctrine addressed failure generated by compliance. The system hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of procedural absence. Without authorization, nothing could be altered. Without alteration, nothing could be corrected. The order had consumed its own framework. By the time activity ceased, it did so unevenly. Some components continued to operate long after purpose had dissolved. Others had already fallen silent. There was no coordinated termination. The system did not end the operation, it exhausted it. What remained was not chaos, but residue. Structures intact but emptied of function. Processes completed without result. Authority present without control. The collapse did not contradict the order. It fulfilled it. Afterward, the structure remained. Forms continued to circulate. Logs were completed. Schedules were updated to reflect termination points that had not been planned. The system did not mark an end so much as it absorbed an absence. Activity declined unevenly, not by command, but by depletion. What could no longer act simply stopped appearing in reports. There was no designated phase for reckoning. The order was no longer referenced directly. Its identifier faded from daily language, replaced by neutral terms that described outcomes without origins. Losses were enumerated without sequence. Gaps were recorded without cause. The system documented effects while severing them from decision. Responsibility dispersed automatically. Each segment of the structure accounted only for its assigned function. Completion was measured against instruction, not against result. Where instruction had been followed, performance was recorded as satisfactory. The system did not evaluate consequence. It verified compliance. Records were reconciled. Discrepancies were normalized through aggregation. Numbers were rounded. Categories were adjusted to accommodate what no longer fit. Anomalies were reclassified until they no longer appeared anomalous. The administrative process restored internal consistency without addressing reality. No individual position possessed the authority to declare the order flawed. Flaw implied judgment. Judgment implied a point of intervention that did not exist. The order had moved through the system legally, formally, and completely. There was nothing to contest procedurally. Those who had executed their segments returned to routine. New directives arrived, formatted in familiar ways. The environment reasserted predictability. Desks returned to standard arrangement. Language returned to standard cadence. The structure repaired itself by continuing. At higher levels, summaries replaced detail. Narratives were condensed into timelines that emphasized duration over deviation. What could not be explained was omitted. What could not be omitted was reframed as unavoidable. The system preferred inevitability to error. No ceremony marked the conclusion. No acknowledgement distinguished this outcome from others. The absence of emphasis was deliberate. Emphasis would have required attention. Attention would have required inquiry. Inquiry was inefficient. The order's documentation was archived, stored among thousands of similar records, indistinguishable in format, identical in authority. It became evidence of process, not of consequence. Its presence in the archive affirmed legitimacy rather than outcome. Training materials remained unchanged. Protocols were not revised. The assumptions embedded in the structure persisted because they had not been formally challenged. Formal challenge required a mechanism the system did not provide. Silence settled, not as denial, but as normalization. The structure continued to function because it had been designed to. Its continuity did not depend on success, only on repetition. New orders entered the same pathways. The same confirmations were generated. The same separations between authority and perception were maintained. The system did not remember the failure as failure. It remembered it as completion. Somewhere within the archive, the order remained exactly as it had been issued, its language intact, its certainty preserved. It did not acknowledge what followed it, because it had never been written to. When the next order moved through the same channels, it encountered no resistance. The pathways were clear. The process was intact. The structure recognized the format and responded as designed. Again, the order began to move, and again, no one was allowed to question it.